We're live.
Hello and welcome to our first webinar of Eat Like You Care. Excited to have you all here. We've got many hundreds of people have registered, and so I just wanted to say hello. My name is Ben MacEllen, and we're doing Eat Like You Care today and talking to Anna Charlton and Gary Francione, who are with us across the plains from me. I'm in Australia and they're in America. So hello to Gary and Anna.
Hello, Ben. Hello,
Hi, Ben.
everyone.
Hi, everyone. Welcome.
Okay, just wanted to say welcome from everybody. It's amazing already. I can see lots of people coming into the room from Ireland, from Australia, from California, Tallahassee, all over the place. So that's wonderful. I just want to make a quick note that we're a friendly group. So if you are making comments in the comments bar, let's keep it friendly. You certainly can ask questions, whether you agree or disagree with the abolitionist approach, that's fine, but let's just keep it nice. Okay, well, let's kick this off. And just wanted to ask Gary, just to tell us briefly a little bit about your background in the animal rights movement.
Well, it was an issue I really didn't think about until the late 1970s. I visited a slaughterhouse and became a vegetarian immediately. I did not know what a vegan was back then. I'd never heard the word vegan. I was not aware that it was possible to live without eating animal products of some sort. I continued to eat dairy and fish. I ate fish for about another year, and then I read an article about how fish felt pain, so I stopped eating fish. And I became a vegan in 1982 when I was introduced to the concept by somebody who was a vegan. And I've been, I really got involved. I wasn't involved with the issue before 1982. That's when I started getting really active. And I was then a lawyer, and so I started doing pro bono. That means I did not charge money for it, but pro bono legal work for various animal groups, mostly at that time PETA. And Anna had not yet gone to law school, and so she was doing non-legal advocacy work. She eventually went to law school, and we ran the Rutgers Animal Rights Law Clinic from 1990 to 2000, the first one of its kind in the world. It was a legal clinic where students got academic credit for learning animal rights theory and for working with us on actual legal cases involving animal issues. And you know, I've been doing it for a long time now. I've written, I don't know, some 5-6 books. I don't know, is it 5 or 6? So it's somewhere around there. Lots of articles and encyclopedia entries, and so
for those who perhaps aren't familiar with the Abolitionist Approach page on Facebook, what's your position now and Anna's position in terms of working as a lawyer or?
Well, neither of us really practices law anymore. We teach and we write is what we do. Somebody just wrote a question and said, why did I go to a slaughterhouse back then? That's a good question. And the answer is because somebody that I was having a conversation with who was a Buddhist and a vegetarian suggested that I go because I didn't really know anything about how animals became food. And so that person suggested I go to a slaughterhouse. I went to a slaughterhouse. It changed my life.
Now, one of the reasons why we're doing this webinar, particularly this great book, Eat Like You Care, is definitely a book that's a great starting place or a platform, whether you're vegan or you're not vegan. I just wanted to ask the question, how did you come to write Eat Like You Care? And was there something in particular that prompted you to write it?
Yeah, I mean, when I wrote Introduction to Animal Rights in the late 1990s, 2000, I was playing with this idea that most people had no problem thinking that the gratuitous infliction of suffering and death on animals was morally wrong. Yet most people exploited animals and engaged in the imposition of gratuitous suffering and death. And and so, you know, I introduced that concept in Introduction to Animal Rights. I think what happened in terms of the thing that really got us to focus on Eat Like You Care was the Michael Vick case. I don't know if people are familiar with that, but Michael Vick is an American football player who got arrested for running a dog fighting ring in Virginia. He owned some land in Virginia. He had a dog fighting operation going on there. He got arrested for it, and he went to prison for it. And people were all upset about Michael Vick. They still are upset about Michael Vick. Michael Vick can't show up anywhere without having animal people out there protesting his presence. And so, you know, I thought, well, it was just interesting to watch this worldwide phenomenon of people condemning Michael Vick. And they were upset with him because he imposed suffering and death on animals, and he had no better reason than, you know, his own pleasure or his amusement in watching this. And I thought, well, you know, but that's no different from people eat animals because they enjoy the taste. It's pleasure. It's a question of palate pleasure, and the reason why I think we wrote Eat Like You Care was that we both really believed that most people think unnecessary suffering and death is wrong. That imposing unnecessary suffering and death on animals is wrong, and that. That's all you need to believe. You don't need any more complicated rights theory to get you to the point where you should stop eating. I mean, in other words, once you accept it's wrong to inflict unnecessary suffering and death on animals, you're committed to veganism. It doesn't really require more than that. And most people already believe that. So we wanted to write a book that showed people how if you had that belief that most people had, it committed you to go vegan.
I think that's something that we had felt very strongly. Is I remind myself that I was someone who very much believed that any cruelty to animals was wrong. Had animals, rescued animals. I look back and I think, who was that person who was able to leave that thinking at the kitchen door when I made my decisions about what I was going to eat, or before I went out and purchased clothing, or all the other things that we consume that use animals? How did that person draw that line? And in teaching about human rights and animal rights, there was no more commonly held belief. There was almost no variety about those consensus that we shouldn't be cruel to animals. We shouldn't use them unnecessarily. It was more consistent than our views about many human rights questions. There might be a spectrum. There might be disagreement about abortion or the death penalty or all the other things that we talk about in terms of the area of human rights. But when it came down to the fundamental idea of should you be unkind, use them unnecessarily, cruel to animals, however you wanted to phrase it, it was a given. I could ask 100 people in the street and I would always get a, well, of course not, you shouldn't be doing that. So we needed to find out why that did not commit people to veganism. So that's the person I remember when I'm talking to people and doing vegan advocacy. I'm talking to me, someone who was concerned, someone who was receptive and ready and just needed that change of viewpoint. Because I think a lot of the vegans who are listening now can't imagine how it took so long. Why didn't they see it? So, you know, I go back and talk to myself, that person who was ready. And I think that this book has turned out to be a useful tool to make people take that step.
So that very much shaped what the audience you were speaking to when you thought about writing the book.
Exactly, because sometimes you have the luxury of a long conversation, perhaps an academic conversation, a good debate about the animal question. But when you're talking to people in your work, in your sphere of influence, in your friends, you need to have a way of talking, introducing the idea and engaging people. And that's when the follow-up conversations will take place. And so this book is really at that interface where the idea gets to people.
There's no doubt about it. The way people respond to this is
so it gives people a tool to get the conversation going.
We've got a question from the room from Paolo. Paolo asks, what about people who agree that animals matter but stop eating them? How do you address that?
I don't even know what that means. I mean, that they matter, but not enough to stop eating them. They're either things or they're not things. They either matter morally or they don't. It's a binary situation. It's not, you know, they either matter morally or they don't. If they don't matter morally, then we have no moral obligations to them. We can do what we want to with them. But if they do matter morally, we can't treat them as things. That's, I mean, you know, if they're not things, if they matter morally, we can't treat them as things. But if we eat them and wear them and use them in other ways, we're treating them as things. So once we accept that animals matter morally, we're committed to not eating them, wearing them, using them. And as a matter of fact, you don't need rights theory at all to lead you to the conclusion that it's wrong to exploit animals. For the only use of animals that we make that isn't transparently frivolous. Transparently frivolous is the use of animals to find cures to serious human illnesses. And that's the one area that we use animal. Now, we don't agree that it's acceptable to do that, but you at least have to have a more complex discussion when you're talking about whether or not it's all right to, you know, if hypothetically you needed to use animals to save human lives in a situation like that, would it be morally acceptable? We don't think it is, but that's the only use of animals that we make that isn't transparently frivolous. All the other uses are transparently frivolous and no different from Michael Vick and fighting dogs. So you don't really even need very, very complicated theory. And this was something we wanted to get across to people, that this didn't require really sophisticated ethical thinking. That what people already believed in terms of their, you know, the conventional wisdom, what they believed as a matter of conventional thinking, got them to the conclusion that they had to stop this.
Okay, we do have a comment just about the sound and a bit of feedback. I'm just wondering if you bring your volume down, whether you'll still be able to hear me, Gary and Anna, but that the audience won't get so much feedback.
Okay.
You might have to lip read my Australian speaking at this point.
Okay, I've lowered it. How are we doing on the feedback?
We'll get some feedback from the.
We'll get some feedback up. We'll get some feedback on the feedback.
Yeah, that's right. So just diverting slightly to, people have issues about their health in terms of going vegan. We have a submitted question from Natalie in the Ukraine, and I think it's a broader question than just what she asks, and that is about where she can get B12. You know, she's a bit concerned about, you know, is that true? Do we need B12? And there's an ongoing question: will I get enough protein? You know, will I get all the nutrients I need if I eat a vegan diet?
Well, the answer is yes. I mean, basically, there is no professional organization and no governmental body that says you need to eat animal products. Everybody is in agreement. Mainstream medicine is in agreement that you can be a healthy vegan if you eat a sound vegan diet. As a matter of fact, many healthcare professionals believe that you're more healthy if you eat an exclusively plant-based diet. But as far as the B12 question is concerned, our bodies make some B12. The problem is we don't make a reliably sufficient amount. We've got to get it from somewhere. All humans get B12 from some exogenous, that is outside of their body, source. So people who eat animals get the B12 from the bacteria in the hind gut of the ruminant who is fermenting vegetables, by the way. So the ruminant animal, they have two stomachs, and in the hind gut, the animal is fermenting and bacteria comes from that, and that's where they get their B12 when they eat meat. We get our B12 from basically supplements, but you've got to get, you can get it from fortified yeast. You can get it from, there's a bunch of sources you can get it from, but everybody gets it from an external source. So it's just a question of where you get it from. It's all basically the same thing. It all comes from this bacteria. It all comes from bacteria, but you can get it in a supplement. You can get it from animals, but you don't have to get it from animals. But you do need B12. There's no doubt about it. You need B12. But there is no, I think the biggest problem, I think one of the most, when I think back about the first 28 years of my life when I ate meat, I'm often wondering, why did I do that? And I guess I thought that if I didn't eat meat, I was going to get sick. As a matter of fact, I remember when I first became a vegetarian, my parents were all upset because they thought I was going to become ill. Because I think the prevailing thinking then was, it was wrong, and it shouldn't have been the prevailing thinking, because the information was available. We didn't have an internet back then, but the information was available. But it just, I think we were so sort of influenced by advertising that if we didn't eat animal products, we were all going to get ill. And that's nonsense. I mean, now we do have the internet. Now we've got access to a lot more information than we had in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. And so we now have this information available, and it's absolutely clear, beyond doubt, that you don't need animal products to be optimally healthy. We've been vegans for 34 years, I guess. It's about 34 years, going on 35 years. And I mean, I actually feel better now than I did when I was much younger and eating all those animal products. I used to get ill all the time. I used to get sore throats. I used to get colds. I got ill. And I teach in a university. I have people sneezing on me all the time. Kids are always, the students are always sick with something or other. I cannot remember the last time I had a cold. People ask me, do I get flu shots? And the answer is no, because A, flu shot, the flu vaccine is made with eggs. I don't want to use it because it's an animal product. But B, I haven't had a flu in 20 some odd years. So, I mean, the idea that you can't be a healthy vegan, and we don't eat exotic, expensive foods. We eat very simple, plain foods. We actually, one of the things we do is we try to figure out how can we make dinner as cheaply as possible, not because we don't want to spend the money on it, but because we're really interested in seeing, what you can do in terms of creative vegan cuisine. And you can make a lot of stuff, and it's cheaper. It's much, much cheaper than a diet that includes animal products.
Now, I don't know if you can see, sorry, go on,
I
Anna.
would imagine, Ben, that most people who are joining us today have a sensible approach to their diet. So anyone who has become vegan or is talking to other people about being vegan needs to do the little bit of homework that needs to be done to make sure that they have a good diet. You obviously can't just live on iceberg lettuce and cucumbers and hope to thrive. There is a certain irony when the medical profession is being overwhelmed and countries are going to be bankrupted dealing with all the problems from the heavy meat and dairy animal-based diet that people are eating, that suddenly you think, I'm going to be going to a more wholesome, simple diet, and we all suddenly have health concerns. I mean, the health concerns should be for the poor people who are still eating the animal-based diet. I mean, there is no bigger favor that you can do for your friends, family, and country than encourage people to go vegan, for heaven's sake.
People
a little bit of homework would be great. Then we would not have children with old hearts by the time they're in their teens. We wouldn't be dealing with the levels of diabetes, the levels of heart disease, the level of stroke that there is. And we talk about getting your protein. Yeah, as I said, you need a little bit of homework, but it's only a little bit to find out where you get your protein. Most people are dealing with the overload on their kidneys of dealing with this huge protein intake that people are having all the time. So it's a little bit of an irony, really, that the vegans are the ones who have to worry about health.
Yeah, I mean, it always makes me laugh when people say, "Well, you're a vegan, don't you worry about health?" And I say, "You're eating decomposing flesh, cow mucus, and chicken ova, asking me whether or not I'm concerned about my plants, not giving me proper nutrition." And
obviously, if you have any sort of medical condition, you should make sure that your diet is designed to help you thrive. that often requires that you find the right medical professional who actually knows something about nutrition, because training in the medical profession about nutrition is very, very poor across the board. So you need to do perhaps a bit of homework to find someone that you can trust who is informed.
I mean, there's a lot of misinformation out there. I mean, a question that we always get is, women will ask, what about osteoporosis? Which just really goes to show how very effective the dairy industry has been in advertising. Because the reality is, the more animal products you eat, the more your system acidifies, and your body tries to alkalinize, get to the pH which is healthier, and that can leach calcium from your bones. We know lots and lots of vegans. None of them have osteoporosis. We know lots of non-vegans, and a number of them have osteoporosis. So, you know, this idea that you need animal products to avoid osteoporosis is nuts. If anything, animal products will hasten and create the conditions in your body which will increase the chances that you get osteoporosis.
And I think we're at a fortunate time in 2016, as you say, to have the internet, to do that little bit of research, and to get as much information that 10 or 20, or when you two were starting to be vegan, that wasn't available. It is just that easy. Now we're going to take a tack a little bit away from diet and health. We've got a question from the room from Beth. I don't know if you two can see it in the comment screen, but it's, why do you feel that it's necessary to couch the moral obligation not to use animals with the second supposition that humans matter more than non-humans?
Well, because the question, if I understand it, is in Eat Like You Care, we basically say that you don't have to, you know, that most people don't believe that animals and that human and non-humans are morally equal. We believe that for purposes of using sentient beings as resources, all sentient beings are equal. But we don't even have to get into that. If somebody believes that animals matter morally, and that, in other words, conventional wisdom, what most people believe is that animals matter morally, but they don't matter as much as humans do. And so, and in situations where there's a real compulsion and necessity, and there's a real conflict, a clash, that it's all right for humans to exploit non-humans. That's what most people believe. And our argument is, even if you believe that, we don't agree with that, and we think there are good arguments that reject that. But even if you do believe that, then you are still in a situation. You're not on a desert island. You're not in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. You're not in a situation where you're being forced to decide if I either die or I eat the animal. You're not in that situation. And we eat animals because they taste good. We wear animals because we like the way we look in animal clothing. And so these are, so even if you believe that animals matter, they don't matter as much as humans, but it's wrong to use animals in situations where there is not a compulsion or necessity, you're still committed to not eating them and wearing them and using them in frivolous circumstances, which is basically all of the circumstances in which we use animals, with the possible exception of using them to find serious human illnesses. And that requires a bit more sophisticated analysis, but that's also a small fraction of animal use. And the 99.99999% of it is transparently frivolous. You don't need any argument beyond saying they matter morally, and we shouldn't impose unnecessary suffering and death on them.
One of the chapters that you talk about in Eat Like You Care, and there's, I mean, really pretty well every question a person can ask, is about tradition and the tradition of eating products, and the argument that, well, we raise animals specifically for that reason. What do you say to people, or what do you encourage other vegans to say in terms of advocacy to that argument?
Well, tradition is a very poor argument for continuing to do anything.
Sexism is a tradition.
Nearly everything that we have been fighting to get beyond with success in some areas and a lot to do in others has been a long tradition. From the very beginning, we've had might versus right and prejudice and sexism and violence. So the fact that we've been doing something for a very, very long time should not be an argument for doing it anymore. And the fact that we bring animals into existence in order to use them in this awful way, when we have a choice not to use animals at all, is also not a good argument. And I think people realize that if you tell them that the use is unnecessary. Our thinking about animals is absolutely contaminated with this idea that our use of them is necessary. So that's what pushes us into, well, they're here and we have to use them, so we'll do it nicely, and all the mess that welfare, and we'll talk about welfare, I'm sure, brings into the conversation. But if we can focus on use and the fact that it is not necessary, then the fact that we could bring an animal into that situation, treat the animal in the way that industry necessarily will treat that animal, right up to the point of a horrible death, makes no sense anymore. So I think if animal advocates will really keep honed in on the importance of talking about use, then
yes,
the fact that we've done it for a long time just sort of fizzles away as a justification. We're all dragging behind us the results of bad things that we've been doing for a very long time. So let today be the day that we stop doing it.
Absolutely. I think further to that, topic, to a room question from Gregory comes into the question of tradition. He says, I have a lot of Buddhist friends. They often counter my arguments in favor of veganism with the fact that the Dalai Lama eats meat because of the claimed medical condition. I responded that he's simply wrong, and despite that, his teachings are to do no harm, and he does urge at least vegetarian diets. Any comment about that?
Well, I'm sorry, I don't really take the Dalai Lama very seriously. The Dalai Lama basically said, well, a couple of days ago, he said he wasn't worried about the white supremacy that Donald Trump and his supporters are energizing, and
it'll all work out.
It'll all work out. Everything will work out. So the Dalai Lama, shows up on cooking shows, and the Dalai Lama eats animal products, and the Dalai Lama thinks that Donald Trump isn't the problem, or that white supremacy is not a problem. I don't really take the Dalai Lama all that terribly seriously. I think
he's a great example about how we all have to struggle with indulging ourselves doing things that we know we should not be doing. So I'm not a Buddhist, so he's not any sort of figurehead for me, and certainly wouldn't be with that sort of thinking. So
I mean, and it's nonsense that he needs to eat it for a medical condition. You know what? That is complete, utter nonsense. This idea that
I'd like to know what the medical condition
is. What's the medical condition? I mean, it is this. You run into people who say, well, I need to eat animal products because it's my body tells me. I have no idea what they're talking about.
My body tells me I should be eating chocolate all the time,
right,
but sometimes you have to say, be quiet and do the right thing.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. The Dalai Lama and his medical condition. What is it?
Any excuse being better than none,
Exactly.
We all just need a little shove to do the right thing.
Exactly.
And we all obviously know Christians that are vegan, Muslims that are vegan, Jews that are vegan, Buddhists that are vegan. So, as you say, the argument is complete nonsense.
That's right.
I do not understand how you can have any spiritual tradition which says you should not do harm and you should not engage in violence. I don't know how you can square that with non-veganism. As a matter of fact, I gave a lecture a few weeks ago down at Florida International University about Jainism. Jainism is the spiritual tradition of ahimsa. And, other traditions have ahimsa, but ahimsa is the central tradition of Jainism. And my argument was, how can you subscribe to a tradition that promotes nonviolence as the central tenet and not be vegan. I just do not understand it. I mean, I think in order to be nonviolent rather, you have to be more than vegan, but you certainly have to be at least vegan. And the idea that you would say, well, I promote nonviolence, but I'm not a vegan, makes no sense to me. It really doesn't. And so I don't understand these traditions, these traditions that say we should respect all life and, no beings should suffer, et cetera, et cetera. I do not understand how those traditions can be how you can be non-vegan and subscribe to those traditions.
We have some great questions coming through from the room. I was going to ask you some questions about, eating humane meat. And we've got a question from Mark. And he asks, is there any evidence that backs up the claim that happy meat leads people to consume more animals or less animals, basically?
Well, yeah, the past several hundred years, basically. We've had animal welfare for a long time now, and we're exploiting more animals now in more horrific ways than any point in human history. Despite the fact that we've had a very strong tradition of animal welfare during that time. I mean, the idea that promoting humane exploitation is going to lead people in the direction of no exploitation is intuitively, obviously wrong. If you tell people that it's morally acceptable to consume animals who are treated in a particular way, how are you going to get them to see that use itself is the problem and is morally objectionable? And so it's asking the. I mean, it's interesting to me because we would never say, for example, if we were dealing with the problem of racism. And let's say we're talking about racism, and I said to you, Ben, I don't really understand. I think that we need proof that, I think if we want to get rid of racism, how do we know that being gentle racists isn't going to work better? Maybe we should, tell less harsh racist jokes or use different racist epithets that are not as harsh as the ones we're using, because maybe being a gentle racist will lead people in the direction of equality. Nobody would ever say that because it's intuitively silly. But yet when it comes to animals, people say, well, what's the proof that these animal organizations, they say if you want people to go vegan, you should tell them anything but go vegan. You should encourage them to eat cage-free eggs and crate-free pork and all this other stuff. You shouldn't talk about veganism. It's too difficult. It's too divided. It's too this. It's too that. You shouldn't talk about veganism. You should talk about anything other than veganism, and that will then move them in the direction of veganism. That is, it's mind-blowing that is so silly, and it just really shows how desperately people want to continue to cling to the old way of thinking, because that makes no sense. And we would never accept that in a human context. So all I can say is, if you're asking the question, is there any proof that happy exploitation, isn't a really good thing? The answer is, gee whiz, come back to me when you're willing to ask that question in a human context. Because the discussion, I mean, it's totally speciesist to be even asking that, to be thinking that approach is okay in the animal context. We would never say it's okay in the human context.
I think of all the emails that come into us every day, and there are a lot, and it's wonderful. I think the most common one is people who write and say, I was a vegetarian for X number of years, and sometimes it's decades. And they say, now I'm vegan. And often people say it's because of the book like that, and that's wonderful to hear. But so often people say, I can't understand why I didn't see it. What took me so long?
Happens all the time.
This now makes no sense. And often the conclusion that the writer has is, nobody told me I should, or nobody told me it was my moral obligation to do so. If you don't make someone aware that that is what is required by their thinking, being what it is, comfort level being what it is, tradition, as you were saying, Ben, being what it is, we'll all settle. Again, when I'm talking to people, to me, when up for the first 25 years or whatever, someone who was interested in animals, but was really keen to settle for something other than the veganism that was required. So does welfare work? I think we have hundreds of years of evidence that it doesn't work. I have a lot of evidence recently that asking people to go vegan with a clear vegan message and not messing around with what level of welfare will help and be acceptable is effective.
I mean, it's an issue.
I know that works.
It's an issue of justice too. I mean, if slavery's wrong, you don't go promoting humane slavery, and we wouldn't be having a discussion about whether making slavery more humane. I mean, if I said to you, Ben, it's really terrible that they stone women in certain countries for doing nothing more serious than talking to their and I think that's really bad, Ben. And what we really need to do is to have a campaign so that these women are stoned with smoother stones, because they're right now using, jagged, they use all sorts of stones. I think we ought to promote the use of smoother stones, because that will lead to the direction of getting rid of stoning. And the answer is, if I said that in response to your concern about the fact that women are stoned for talking to men to whom they're not married, you would think I was confused, to say the very least. But this is the same problem I have with these people who say, well, yeah, it's an issue of justice, we shouldn't be doing it, but the solution is to propose doing it in a better, more humane or more compassionate way. There is no right way to do the wrong thing. We ought not to entertain that thought. We don't do it in a human context for very good reasons. We shouldn't do it in an animal context.
In terms of vegetarianism, you mentioned about that before. Many vegans started off as vegetarian. Others, like myself, we moved away from meat for a short time and then went vegan fairly quickly. But what do you think is the impediment for vegetarians to go vegan? Is it that they're not thinking about? We think about just the killing of a on your plate meat animal as opposed to dairy and eggs.
I think industry has done such a wonderful job about telling us that animals used in the dairy and egg industry that is a pack of lies, and anyone would like to go to a house, to an egg production unit, to a dairy farm and sees what's going on. The idea that is any better than what produces a slab of meat on your plate is nonsense. That's a nice word for it, is nonsense. So we have to get away from that. We have to get away. I think there's a whole new generation of medical professionals coming out who have much better understanding about nutrition. So that helps get the necessary off the plate too. But we need a clear message and not settling for something that is immoral.
Now, I've just got a message here. Sorry to interrupt you, Anna, on a brilliant point, but apparently we lost audio and video for a minute there. Just checking to see whether we've got it back again. Getting some feedback there now. Okay, now it's back on now. Okay. So I hope I might get you to repeat some of that if you can remember what you said. But we were basically talking about the dairy and egg industry and vegetarianism as opposed to veganism. Sorry, Anna.
First of all, it is irrational. There is no argument that it's coherent to think that taking all the products that we produce by keeping animals in these dreadful industries is not somehow morally as bad as eating the last product of those poor sad bodies when they've been through a slaughterhouse. It's that they don't die of old age, they don't die of boredom, they're not euthanized, nobody comes up and assassinates them in their sleep. They have short, violent, nasty lives, and they die in fear and suffering in slaughterhouses. No product that comes from that is any less contaminated with all those moral problems than the final exhausted, expired body. Let's tell ourselves that that's okay, and let's not settle for diverting ourselves away from what we think is the big moral problem of meat. It's all bad, it's all unnecessary, and we can stop it all.
I mean, look, there's as much suffering and death in a glass of milk as there is in a pound of steak. And it's because, we have an animal movement that basically, promotes vegetarianism, which is actually a morally incoherent position. There's really, there's no way to draw the line between meat and other animal products. They're all the same. They all involve suffering. They all involve death. They all involve injustice. So the idea that we can distinguish these things is just nonsense.
We have a couple of questions that are similar here, one in the room, and I've got one submitted through Facebook. Maria in the room says, I have a friend who insists that it's not possible for people to go vegan instantly, and it takes a long time for them to be ready. She insists I am wrong and says that she cannot stop eating meat because there is something about her ancestors that stop her. Excuses, but I just can't get through to her.
Then I think you just stay friends with someone, because I think your example of being a thriving vegan, you're a normally functioning, thriving vegan, is the best thing to do. There's obviously some barrier. That reason is not getting through to that person. There's some barrier, discomfort or whatever. So I would move on to the next person because there will be a frustration level that will be disheartening if that is the focus of your advocacy. I think being the best example of a normally functioning, thriving vegan is the best that you can do in those circumstances. If we're going off into the ether of her ancestors telling her this, that, and the other, and there being some barrier, no, there's no barrier. If that was, again, as Gary was saying, if that was the reason that someone wasn't acting morally in a different circumstance, we would have a real problem with that.
Look, yes, it's ridiculous. People can go vegan. Lots of people go vegan very quickly. Sorry, excuse me, very quickly, immediately. If you think about this in the human context, if you had a situation in which the rights of humans were the fundamental rights of humans were being violated, and somebody said, I think that's really wrong, we ought not to do that, but it's going to take me a long time to stop, we would come to the conclusion that the person really didn't take these ideas seriously, which is exactly the same conclusion you have to come to. If somebody says, I think animals matter, but I have to go on a journey because this is going to take me a long time, my conclusion is they're not really taking the idea seriously. They don't really care.
Got another question from the room from Oksana. What about those people who say vegans hurt animals too, indirectly? So what's the point? If not all, then nothing. I totally understand that we vegans do as much as we can, at least we try. But how do you address that idealistic all or nothing argument?
I think that's usually someone trying to divert the conversation. Indeed, I recognize that by existing, I'm harming other animals, and I'm usually harming humans too. Yeah. It's consumption and industry and life, unfortunately, has an impact on other beings with whom we share the planet. But most of us can do more than we're doing. And one thing I always think is veganism is such a wonderful thing because it's within our control and we can do it, and we don't need a government program, and we can do it even if no one else is doing it. We have control over some of our impact. It's great that that's within our own control. You can make that decision not to purchase anything that comes from those industries. And as veganism, I know, is not a diet, but if we make the dietary change, there won't be all these cheap available byproducts that then are used in other industries. So the paint that you use in your house will be easier to find without an animal product. They won't be using animal products in the tarmac when they pave the road. It won't be used in the steel industry for all the components of building. It won't be used as an emulsifier. It won't be used to glue together your prized vegan shoes that you thought were all vegan. So we have this we're awash in cheap byproducts of this massive animal industry. So we will find some other way to get products that will fulfill that purpose. And let's not lose sight and be distracted by those sorts of arguments. Indeed, growing crops of any sort means that field mice will be hurt when the crops are brought in. But I'm always a little suspect when people are suddenly interested in the field mice, because those field mice are going to be killed for the crops that feed animals too. So,
as a matter of fact, if we were all eating plants, there would be many fewer acres under cultivation. So we'd be indirectly and unintentionally killing fewer animals in the crop production process.
Right.
And if we were all vegans, we would be looking for ways to minimize any adverse impact. But the reality is, living results in living results in harming others. When we build a road, we know that a certain number of people will be killed on that road in automobile accidents, given the number of lanes and the speed. We can even calculate how many people will be killed on that road. But surely we all still draw a difference between people who are unintentionally killed in highway accidents and actually going and murdering those people. We draw the line. We say, you can morally distinguish the situations. Yes, if we're going to build a road, people are going to be harmed. But still, there's a difference between building a road where people are unintentionally and accidentally harmed and intentionally harming people. But yet when it comes to animals, again, the common sense thinking that characterizes our approach to human problems just goes down the toilet. And we say, but wait a minute, we can't live a perfect life, so therefore let's eat animals. And the thing is, well, that's like saying we can't live a perfect life where humans are concerned, so let's all engage in murder. Because that's exactly the analogy, and it works. I mean, that's an exact analogy.
A question from Valentina: what do you think about the die-in vegan actions when people make a performance with blood or fur in front of McDonald's or fur stores? Is this sort of action make sense?
I think that sort of street theater is by and large not particularly effective. I mean, there's a group here, Direct Action Everywhere, that does that sort of thing. They actually do not promote veganism as a moral baseline. I think they actually confuse people, and I think that I think that we need to be educating people about veganism. And we need, people don't have the information. Let's give them the information. Let's give them the arguments. Most of the sorts of events that are being described in Valentina's question are street theater. They're street theater events which are put on by organizations that are then seeking donations. I think this is really the main problem of the movement. Is it's a business, and it's out there trying to get donations, and it's trying to get money, and it's and I think that's fundamentally problematic.
Apart from the very young children who may be going into the fast food restaurant, every other patron of that fast food restaurant or wherever this demonstration is taking place knows that they're eating a dead body. It's not news to them.
Right.
We just need to be focusing their thinking about it. And I think confronting in that way and really accusing in that way makes people less receptive. I think people can hear when you're not yelling at them.
Yes.
We're not better than other people. We're not more advanced. We're not more ethical. We've just realized something. And I think in a calm, thought out, supportive, helpful, but also clear conversation, you can make your point in the street. There are enough people dying in the street.
Well,
I mean, yeah, I mean, one thing I wanted to add to that, and that is, you know, there are some people, you know, who say, well, you know, the ideology of animal exploitation is invisible, and we've got to make it visible to people. The answer is that's nonsense. The ideology of animal exploitation is quite visible. It's the ideology of animal welfare. It's the ideology that it's all right for us to exploit animals as long as we do so in a humane way. And so, you know, as Anna says, you know, the people who are going into the McDonald's or the, you know, whatever restaurant is involved, they know they're eating dead animals. It's not that this is some news to them. You know, the idea is to not, you're not really going to get very far by telling them they're eating dead animals. They already know that. You're only going to get to them by getting them to focus on their behavior and getting them to see that it's inconsistent with what they already believe.
Well, that leads really to Matthew's question. Do either Gary or Anna have any tips for generating discussion in normal daily life with strangers? So to get more opportunities to promote a veganism.
Oh man, Matthew, that's the story of our lives is having discussions with people. You know, you can have discussions with anybody, anywhere, basically. If you're creative about it, you can get into discussions about this really quite easily. When people see you know, when people are standing in line with us at a supermarket and they see what we're buying, that we're buying 12 heads of kale or something like that, and people say, you know, what's going on there? What are you doing? And, well, we're vegans. That's a very, very easy way to get, you know, to get people involved in a discussion. When you're sitting in a veterinarian's office with other people who are all upset about their companion animals being ill, and you know, you can raise, I mean, I do this all the time in veterinarians' offices. I say, you know, isn't it interesting how some animals we regard as members of our family, and then most of us go home and eat animals. You know, you can get people focused on these things. You know, you don't have to be a professor and talking to students or giving public lectures. Just one-on-one all the time. You can look, as the fundamental premise of Eat Like You Care is, most people think that animals matter morally. They may not agree that animals matter more, that humans and non-humans are equals in certain senses. They may not understand, they may not accept that, but they accept that animals have moral value. As long as they accept animals have moral value, they are committed to eliminating their participation in all animal use that is frivolous, and that includes just about everything. The only person that argument isn't going to work with is the person who says, yes, but I'm finding a cure for cancer by killing animals. We don't agree with that. We think that's wrong. But that requires a different discussion than the discussion that you have with the person who eats animals because they get palate pleasure. In one sense, the use is transparently frivolous. In the other, it's not transparently frivolous. We think it's wrong, but it requires a deeper examination.
We're coming near the end of the hour. That's gone really quickly. We've got another question from Dave. Some people claim to agree with the basic moral point, but say they won't go vegan because their personal habits or actions don't make much of a difference. For the same reason, these people might not vote in elections or recycle. What would you say to those kind of people?
Well, I think we've been encouraged to think that our individual actions, our individual contributions don't make a difference. There's a lot of political turmoil going on right now across the world. There always is, but there's some interesting developments at the moment, and we're all seeing that we can have input and importance in that. In terms of being vegan, boy, is that an area where your individual choice can make a difference. That's going back to what I said before, is that I have very little ability to influence foreign policy, you know, to turn the ship of state around into an area, into a direction that I would like. But I do have the ability, because I have some consumer choice. Not everyone has the same amount of consumer choice. Some people have more limited choices and are in different situations, but many of us have that power of the purse and the power of our choices. And so I find it refreshing and empowering that we have that ability to say, here on my plate, this is what happens. In my house, this is what happens. And that spreads. It really is a time for us to get backbone and a bit of discipline and a bit of courage and go out and do it.
It's also not just a matter of having effect. It's a matter of justice. It's a matter of, I mean, when I'm in a situation where I have a moral obligation to another human to do something, to just think in terms of whether or not my discharge of that obligation is going to have an effect and some wide, you know, some wide way or some broad way, is to miss the point that there's an element of justice in there. When I am consuming that animal, I am participating directly in the exploitation of non-humans. It is no different when I go to the store and I buy the chicken, or I buy the eggs, or I buy the milk. That is no different from my going and killing that animal. I'm just paying somebody else to kill the animal. I am participating in an unjust act. I am participating in an act which violates the fundamental rights of others. So I ought not to be doing that. I also agree with Anna. It does have an effect. I do believe it has an effect, but that's not the only aspect of what shapes moral behavior. It's not just a question of what effect it has, is what is my moral obligation, you know, not only just in terms of what effect it's going to have, but in terms of what duties of justice do I owe others. So I may think that my discharge of my obligation in a particular circumstance is not going to have it's not going to have any broad impact. It's not going to change the world, but it is going to allow me to discharge my obligation of justice to that person, whether that's a human person or a non-human person, in that circumstance. And that's important. That's an important part of what morality is. And, you know, if you take that thinking to its logical conclusion, basically nobody ever does anything, because, you know, if you can't change the world, then you might as well not do anything. And so it leads to a sort of it leads to a situation where nobody ever does anything, ever cares about morality. What a horrible world that would be.
We often find ourselves in situations where a friend or a family member may offer us a piece of food that is clearly non-vegan, or be in a social situation. What advice can you give to people who feel pressured in that situation, particularly with family, to be, I guess, a flexitarian and not want to offend grandma when she offers you a piece of cake with cream on it?
Well, this can be difficult in family situations, and I get lots of messages and emails about this. And
we're actually writing a new book about this, about how to talk in particular circumstances with people. But go ahead.
You know, in lots of parts of the world, we're coming up to holiday periods, certainly in the West, and holidays can be difficult with families. I can't think of any other principal position that we take that is diluted just because someone else has a different view. Perhaps we've all sat around holiday tables with the unfortunate experience of hearing, you know, another person invited telling an off-color joke, a sexist joke, a racist joke or something. We don't join in and laugh because of the social circumstances, or at least we shouldn't. So I think if someone is offered something that you don't eat for moral reasons, you thank them kindly, and you say, thank you, no, I don't eat that. Not I can't eat that, I don't eat that. And eat something else. Go armed with your own food that people can enjoy and share. After a while, you start to anticipate these problems and confrontations or something, is you diffuse them, keep the atmosphere happy, so you're not the strange vegan person, but you're the vegan person. And I think it's a mistake to think that your moral position has to be watered down because someone else has cooked something for you.
Look, I actually think you're doing people a favor by educating them about veganism. When I look back on the first part of my life when I ate animal products, I wish somebody had explained this to me. Nobody ever did. And so, you know, I think that you're doing them a favor. Now, obviously, we believe in creative, nonviolent vegan advocacy. So we're not suggesting that you should, go to your house, or, go to your parents' house for, the holidays and start becoming obnoxious or, with people or insulting them. But you don't have to do that. I mean, the thing of it is that to the extent that, your family's willing to engage you, look at that as a real opportunity to help them out and sort of try to educate them. And one of the things that's really important is showing them that you take this seriously. So if grandma gives you a piece of cheesecake and says, but I baked this for you, you don't have to tell her that, that she's an evil Nazi, but it would be, but what you should say is, look, grandma, I don't consume this. I don't eat this because animals suffered and died for this, and there's we can't, that's not right. It wasn't fair to those animals. It wasn't just what we did to those animals to make that cheesecake. It involved a violation of their rights. It wasn't right what we did to them, and I can't participate in that. I can't participate in that violence. And if people want to get upset with you because you explain things in a nonviolent way and in a way in which you're trying to sort of interact with, you're not actively seeking to be disrespectful or abrasive. If people get upset about your expression of your views and your strongly held views in that situation, you need to ask yourself who you are as a person, because if your commitment to morality is that shaky, and is able to be undermined that easily, then you need to think about that, because at some point in time you got to stand up for what you believe in, and and that doesn't mean that you have to, harm, that you shouldn't harm people in standing up for what you believe. But you need to do that. You need to stand up for what you believe, or else we have an increasingly violent, unjust world.
I've got one more question from the room, and then I really just want to give you both an opportunity to give a last word and last thought. But one from Tim that Gary started to talk about was, Professors Charlton and Francione, would you please tell us a bit, briefly, I'm saying, about your new upcoming book on vegan advocacy that I understand is due out sometime in the near future?
Yeah, I mean, we're writing a book which is sort of a follow-on from Eat Like You Care, and it's a sort of a how-to, more of a how-to book. I mean, Eat Like You Care in certain ways is a how-to book. I mean, it's a book which was written in part for vegans to sort of inform their advocacy about, how to deal with the various things that they hear from people when they say they're vegan. People say, yeah, but what about God, or what about tradition, or what about what's natural, et cetera, et cetera. So Eat Like You Care addresses those problems, and so it is a book which is intended to help vegans advocate, as well as to get non-vegans to see that what they already believe commits them to veganism. But the new book is going to actually sort of focus on particular situations, how to deal with family, how to deal in relationship situations, how to deal with friends who are animal advocates but who promote welfarism. I mean, that's a problem, because animal people tend to want to be with other animal people. Lots of times they're with animal people who are promoting welfare reform or promoting single issue campaigns or these other sorts of things that we think are really counterproductive. And so how to talk to them about the problems with promoting humane treatment or pursuing single issue campaigns. So it's basically a book, it will deal with particular situations, and it also has general, some general sort of guides about how to talk to people, how to have conversations about serious moral issues without having it degenerate, you know, into hostility and into, you know, into fighting and things like that.
And also how to promote veganism in your own community, how to make it easier for people, because there are social, structural, economic barriers for some people making vegan choices easily. We teach in the law school that we teach in is in a very poor city, one of the poorest cities in the United States, Newark, New Jersey, and so it's been very interesting and important to try and support efforts to get vegan food into that community more easily, both the economic barriers that there are and the availability barriers. No matter what your sphere of influence and what your interest is, there are ways to bring veganism into that. I've done a lot of work with prisons, getting vegan food into prisons. That's been important, I think, and rewarding, and it's an interesting interface with all the problems of the penal system in this country, and they're mirrored in other countries too. So no matter what your expertise, no matter how you work, no matter what your community is, if you're part of child advocacy, if you're part of a church, if you're part of an environmental group, there are all sorts of ways that you can make a clear vegan message part of your interactions with other people. So we will be talking about that. We get tons and tons of feedback from wonderful people, some of whom are probably with us tonight, who are doing great work on this. So we will put some examples that are absolutely inspiring to us and will be to other people.
Ben, look, you know, Fidel Castro just died, and he held the world's record for giving speeches, I think 7 hours at the Third International of the Communist Party. We're sort of the Fidel Castro of veganism. We can keep on going. I know it was scheduled for an hour. We seem to have
about that.
we seem to have a lot of people still in the room. It seems that there are several hundred people, and so we're willing to stay for a while longer if that's okay. If you have the time, we can go for a few more minutes if that's all right, and take some more questions. I wanted to say one thing. Yes, we have a chapter in the book in which we educate people about how to deal with veganism in economically deprived communities, because we think that that's really important. And George, could you please stop? George is scratching on the floor. George, please stop that. We don't know why he's doing that, but he's doing that. And one of the questions I saw coming up on the little sidebar is how we feel about intersectional veganism. Since we started this work in the 1980s, we've been very clear that those people who are concerned about speciesism need to also be concerned about racism, sexism, classism, and other forms of discrimination, and we ought to reject them all. Human rights and animal rights are inextricably intertwined. You can't say that, well, I care about animals and I reject speciesism, but I don't have a position on racism or sexism. If you have a position on speciesism, you necessarily have a position on racism and sexism. You must reject it, because the whole argument about speciesism is that it's wrong to use the irrelevant criterion of species to exclude certain beings from the moral community. Well, that argument applies in any situation in which we're using sex or gender identification or whatever the characteristic is that we're using to exclude people from the moral community. We ought not to be doing that. What concerns me about the so-called intersectional vegans, because that was the question. The question is how we felt about intersectional veganism. There are a group of people these days who call themselves intersectional vegans. A number of them, particularly the prominent ones, take the position that they reject veganism as a moral baseline because they say, well, you know, people who are in lower socioeconomic conditions may not be able to be vegans as easily, or women, you know, or we shouldn't be telling women that they ought to be vegans because that's sexist. The bottom line is it's a moral imperative. And just as, you know, it's a moral imperative. And the idea that we ought not to be promoting veganism as a moral baseline if you're dealing with people of color or women or any marginalized group, is speciesist itself. And so we reject that. We absolutely do. I mean, actually one of the leading intersectional people is this woman, Breeze Harper, who goes by the pen name, I guess, of Sista Vegan, the Sista Vegan Project, and she talks about veganism is a matter of the who you are space, or and that it's a matter of who you are and what you are and where you are at a particular time of your life, and you can't say that animal exploitation is always wrong. And the answer is, sorry, I reject that. The idea that we don't have to be vegans all the time if I think it's the expression "who you are space." Is that the expression? I believe that's what she says. It's the matter of the who you are space. I don't. My commitment, my obligation, not to victimize the vulnerable, ain't a matter of my who you are space. It's an absolute moral obligation that I have, just as I have a moral obligation not to inflict suffering or death on other humans. I have an obligation not to inflict suffering or death on non-humans, and that's not a matter of my the who you are space. It's an absolute moral obligation. And a number of the people who identify as, quote, intersectional vegans buy into this idea that it's not a matter of a moral baseline, and I reject that completely. Having said that, I have from the early 1980s made it absolutely crystal clear that human rights and non-human rights are inextricably intertwined. You can't separate them out. If you're in favor of human rights, you ought to be in favor of non-human rights. If you're in favor of non-human rights, you ought to be in favor of human rights. These are all inextricably intertwined.
And if there are economic issues that make it more difficult for, less convenient, more challenging perhaps for some people to follow a vegan diet, then we should be doing absolutely everything that we can to be part of those communities, to be respectfully asking what we can do to help if we're not part of those communities ourselves, to get rid of this idea that being a vegan diet is some expensive, exotic, strange thing. The vast majority of the world essentially eats a vegan diet with a bit of meat thrown in there, but the basic subsistence diet that so much of the world lives on is predominantly vegan. There are plenty of great resources now about inexpensive vegan choices. So that's something that we should be promoting.
On howdoigovegan.com, which is one of our sites, we actually feature recipes. Francis McCormick is developing a lot of very inexpensive vegan recipes. Marlene Watson-Tara, who's also in Ireland, is doing an excellent job, and has been doing for a while an excellent job of producing inexpensive vegan meals. We've got the idea that veganism is a matter of elitism, that it's expensive, that you need to go to, high-end supermarkets to buy vegan food. That's nonsense. As a matter of fact, most of the stuff that you buy at the high-end, supermarket, the high-end vegan stores or whatever stores that sell high-end vegan food, that stuff is processed food. It's nutritionally not very good for you anyway, generally high in salt. All you need: fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, grains. You can get those almost anywhere, and they're cheap. So, unless you buy something particularly exotic, you can eat vegan very, very cheaply. As a matter of fact, plant foods are less expensive than animal foods. That's just an economic reality. Even though the animal foods are highly subsidized, they're still more expensive. And so the bottom line is, if they weren't subsidized, they'd be astronomical. But the bottom line is that fruits, vegetables, seeds, grains, are available basically everywhere, and they're cheap.
but there are people who are experiencing great economic vulnerability.
Absolutely.
So it's up to us to go into those communities and ask the people who are already doing excellent work in those communities and saying, how can we help? And get good, nutritious vegan food in there. Talk to the people who are running the soup kitchens. Talk to the people who are running the food pantries. Talk to the social workers. Talk to the people who are dealing with people who are coming out of the penal system. Talk to religious people who are active in those communities and say, how can we help? What are you doing? What can we do to help you make your community thrive better? Veganism can be part of that. There are people doing heroic work, and we can help on the vegan front with the networks that are already developed there in terms of distributing food, giving access to food. And let's stop sending the contributions to the welfare groups that are doing absolutely nothing except guaranteeing people employment for the rest of their life on these ridiculous welfare campaigns, and let's put it on the front lines. Instead of writing a check because you got a sob story from yet another group, go and give some vegan food to a food pantry. You'll change somebody.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. I think we should unfortunately wrap it up. There's lots of questions that we can feed through to Gary and Anna, perhaps for some of those live videos or the videos that have been recently popping up on how to go vegan, how do I go vegan, and also the abolitionist approach. But also we intend to have a lot more of these webinars go into depth about the abolitionist approach, about advocacy, about food. I mean, it'd be great to have Marlene and Francis on and talk to them about cooking on a small budget. So that's great. But what I want to do, just as a last word to you both, is if you could come up with, if you could think of something that would start off a conversation to have a pre-vegan, somebody who's nearly got it, what would you say to them to start them off? I know that could probably run another half an hour, but what sort of a key question that you would ask them to maybe tip them over to being a vegan?
I would ask them, I guess, I would ask, do you think animals are things that have no moral value, or do you believe that they have moral value? And then if they say, I believe they have moral value, I would say, why are you eating them? Why are you wearing them? Tell me why. You know, and Ben, I must ask that question 500 times a month in various circumstances. You know, I just ask the question. I mean, I ask people the question in different forms, that question. And you'd be surprised how a simple question like that can start a most interesting exchange.
I think most of us have lived with an animal, a companion animal, and have had a strong emotional bond with that animal. And I think just focusing on what is the difference between the dog, cat, fish, bird, or whatever that we've been fond of, and the animal that ends up dead on the plate is a really good way to refocus the conversation.
This is Maya. Maya. This is Maya, who is one of our rescues. She was born in a rescue, actually. I had a very sad story. And she's been with us for a number of years, and she's a wonderful little person. And my view is that, you know, lots of people, almost everybody I meet has had a relationship with an animal that's been really significant in their lives. And, you know, where they've loved an animal and they've mourned an animal's passing in a you know, where they've really grieved over the loss of an animal. And asking them the simple question, what's the difference between the animal you love and the animal you stick a fork into, can result in a very interesting discussion. This is really not rocket science. It really isn't. I mean, this is most people. There are some people who don't care, and you know what? People who don't care, move on to there are lots of people who do care. So if you find somebody who really doesn't care, move on to the next person who does care. There are lots and lots and lots of people who care. That's clear. We're doing, you know, we started the, you know, the Abolitionist Approach website, I think 2005, 2006. Thousands and thousands of people have been exposed to this thinking. We get constant messages from people about how they've never thought about it this way because they've been involved in the organizations, and the organizations tell them that as long as they're reducing suffering somehow by eating cage-free eggs or crate-free pork, or they're vegetarian but not, as long as they're doing something, as they're reducing suffering, then they're discharging their moral obligations to animals. And no one's ever said to them, no, it doesn't work that way. It's if you believe animals matter, it's not a question of whether the treatment is humane, it's whether the use is morally justifiable and consistent with fundamental notions of justice. And if you come to the conclusion that animals, if you believe animals matter morally, then you must come to the conclusion that we cannot justify our use, however humane the treatment, we can't justify the use. And you know, I wanna leave people with a thought tonight, and that is, we live in a world in which you can't live a perfect life. We all have to do, you know, we all ought to try. We ought to consume less. We all should, you know, we should all be concerned about the effect that we have on the world. But just as we all accept that whatever unintended harm or incidental harm results from our conduct, we all agree that directly harming vulnerable beings, innocent beings, is wrong. We recognize that in the human context easily. We need to recognize it in the non-human context as well. When we consume animal products, when we go to the store, we buy an animal product, whether we, you know, to eat or to wear, it's no different from our killing that animal ourselves. You know, it's like I teach my students in criminal law, I teach criminal law. There's no difference between my killing you and my hiring somebody else to kill you. It's murder in both cases. So even though I don't pull the trigger, I pay somebody else to pull the trigger. It's murder for me. It's murder for the person who pulls the trigger. Similarly, when we participate in animal exploitation, we are participating directly in the fundamental rights violation of beings who have moral value. We're doing something wrong. We ought not to be doing it. And we ought not to be thinking about whether we can do it more humanely. We need to start thinking that we shouldn't be doing it at all.
Well, that's fantastic. This, sorry.
Well, I mean,
this is not the end of the conversation by any means. It's the end of this particular chat. All the questions that have been in the chat room, we'll keep an eye on and look at answering over the in the next webinars or over the next weeks on the Facebook pages. It's been terrific to speak to both of you and to hear some of your enlightened and wise words about this. I think everyone in the room has been saying thank you very much to you both for taking your time to talk to us. The replay will be available. They'll be sent out to anyone who's registered, that you can then pass it on to anybody that you'd like to. So if you've got any pre-vegan or non-vegan friends or family, please pass it on. But we will continue this conversation. I will end it here from Australia, and goodbye to you. You're in Newark, aren't you?
We're not in Newark right now, but no, we're in that time zone.
We're in that time zone.
We're in that time zone. Ben, Anna and I want to thank you for setting this up, because you know, I mean, this is the first time that we've used this webinar software, and now that we see that it really works well, we intend to exploit you a great deal in terms of having these things regularly. I noticed one thing we might do for webinars, there have been a lot of questions about, obviously there are a number of people out there who are very critical of the things that we promote in terms of the abolitionist approach, and we can have a webinar where they can just present all of their criticisms, and I'll be happy, and Anna will be happy to address them all. So that's a possible webinar that we might have. But these things, the possibilities are endless.
Look, there were great questions from the disagreement point and from the agreement point. This particular webinar, we were focusing on eat like you care, but there's certainly, as you say, I know you two do not shy away from answering the hard questions. from the tractors. So we will do that another time. But thank you again, and we will say good night. And
peace to everybody. Bye. Bye.
The world is vegan if you want it.
Indeed.